People do not laugh at an old rifle because they understand it. They laugh because they have never seen what it has survived. The Marine Corps long-range training range shimmered beneath the bright desert sun as heat waves danced above the distant targets stretching farther than most people could see with the naked eye. Precision rifles rested neatly on bipods while young Marines checked optics, range cards, wind meters, and ballistic computers with practiced confidence. Conversations drifted across the firing line, filled with technical terms, friendly competition, and quiet determination. Every shooter wanted to impress the visiting officers observing the day's advanced marksmanship demonstration. Then a weathered pickup truck rolled slowly into the parking area. The engine stopped, and an elderly man stepped out carrying a long rifle case that looked almost as old as the truck itself. Daniel Brooks moved without hurry. At 83 years old, his white hair caught the morning light, and the deep lines across his face spoke of decades spent outdoors rather than behind a desk. He wore plain work clothes, sturdy boots, and a faded veteran's cap that attracted little attention. What drew every eye was the rifle he calmly removed from its case. Its stock had been coated in bright orange years earlier, the finish worn smooth by countless careful hands and countless miles of honest use. Against the sleek black precision rifles surrounding him, it looked strangely out of place. One young Marine stopped tightening his scope rings and stared. Another nudged the man beside him before quietly pointing toward the unusual firearm. Within seconds, amused smiles spread down the firing line. Corporal Ethan Miller folded his arms and walked toward the elderly veteran with easy confidence. "Sir," he said with a grin, "I thought the museum was on the other side of the base." Several nearby Marines laughed. Daniel looked up, meeting the younger man's eyes with nothing more than a calm smile. "Good morning." Ethan circled the rifle slowly without asking permission to touch it. "That orange stock is impossible to miss." Another Marine chuckled. "Maybe it is painted that way so nobody accidentally takes it seriously." More laughter followed. Daniel carefully laid the rifle across the shooting mat and gently brushed a speck of dust from the worn stock with the sleeve of his shirt. His movements were slow, respectful, almost familiar, as though greeting an old friend instead of preparing a piece of equipment. Ethan shook his head with amused disbelief. "You actually plan to shoot with that?" Daniel nodded once. "If the range allows it." "Against these rifles?" Ethan gestured toward the rows of modern precision systems equipped with advanced optics and electronic accessories. "Technology has changed a little since your day." Daniel glanced across the open range where distant target markers disappeared into shimmering air. The steady desert breeze lifted a few grains of sand across the concrete firing line before fading once more. "The wind still moves the same way," he said quietly. Ethan laughed again, convinced he had just won the exchange. Around them, more Marines gathered, curiosity replacing routine, as they waited to see what the elderly visitor might do next. Daniel remained completely unbothered. He rested one weathered hand on the orange rifle and looked toward the horizon with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that distance was measured by more than yards alone. The laughter lingered across the firing line long after Daniel Brooks had quietly settled onto the shooting mat. Young Marines continued making final adjustments to expensive optics while occasionally glancing toward the bright orange rifle with amused expressions. Some whispered jokes to one another. Others simply smiled and shook their heads, convinced they were watching an elderly veteran cling to memories that no longer belonged in a modern precision range. Daniel seemed completely unaware of their opinions. He unzipped a worn canvas pouch and carefully removed a small cleaning cloth that had obviously traveled with the rifle for many years. Without the slightest sign of hurry, he wiped a thin layer of desert dust from the receiver before checking the action with slow, practiced movements. Nothing about the routine looked theatrical. Every motion appeared natural, repeated so many times that it no longer required conscious thought. Corporal Ethan Miller watched with folded arms before stepping closer again. "You really trust that old thing?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "It has never given me a reason not to." Ethan laughed. "You know, every rifle out here was built with technology that did not even exist when that one was made. Daniel gently closed the bolt and rested one hand across the weathered stock. Experience does not become obsolete because calendars change. A nearby Marine picked up one of the electronic wind meters and held it toward Ethan with a grin. Maybe we should loan him one. More laughter followed. Daniel looked across the open valley where distant range flags lifted softly before settling again. He watched the mirage shimmering above the dry ground for several quiet seconds before lowering his eyes toward the nearest patch of loose sand. A faint breeze crossed the firing line from left to right. He noticed it without reaching for a single electronic instrument. Ethan followed his gaze with obvious curiosity. "What are you looking at?" Daniel answered calmly. "The same wind you are measuring." Ethan held up the electronic device. "This tells me exactly what the wind is doing." Daniel nodded politely. "It tells you what it is doing where you are standing." The younger Marine frowned without replying. Before anyone could continue the conversation, one of the range officers announced that an extended distance steel target had just been positioned far beyond the standard qualification line for a special demonstration later that morning. Excited conversations immediately spread through the Marines as estimates of the distance varied from group to group. Some believed the target had been placed beyond anything normally attempted during routine training. Others argued that only specially configured competition rifles could reliably reach it. Daniel quietly listened while continuing to prepare his rifle with patient attention. He never asked how far away the target stood. He never questioned whether it could be reached. He simply looked toward the distant hillside until the steel plate became little more than a tiny shape against the endless desert landscape. Ethan noticed the direction of his gaze and smiled again. "Do not tell me you are thinking about shooting that target." Daniel answered with the same steady voice he had used all morning. "I am thinking about the wind between here and there." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You have confidence. I will give you that." Daniel rested his hand lightly against the orange stock once more. "Confidence comes and goes," he said quietly. "Trust takes much longer to build." Those words settled into the warm morning air just as several senior personnel arrived near the observation area overlooking the range. Among them stood Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed, who paused the moment he noticed the elderly veteran beside the unusual orange rifle, his expression changing from casual interest to quiet curiosity. Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed remained near the observation platform, his attention no longer fixed on the rows of sophisticated precision rifles lining the firing line. Instead, his eyes followed the elderly veteran with the bright orange rifle. There was something strangely familiar about the quiet rhythm of Daniel Brooks's preparation. It was not the rifle that caught his attention. It was everything surrounding it. Daniel never rushed. He never searched for approval. He simply observed the landscape with the patience of someone who understood that every successful shot began long before a finger ever touched the trigger. Corporal Ethan Miller noticed the Master Gunnery Sergeant watching and smiled confidently. "Sir, you picked a good time to stop by. We have a museum exhibit on Lane 7. Several nearby Marines laughed again while glancing toward Daniel. Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed offered only a brief smile before asking, "Has he fired yet?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet, sir." "Who is he?" "Just an old veteran visiting the range with a rifle that probably belongs in a display case." Reed looked toward Daniel once more. Sometimes display cases hold history. Ethan assumed the remark was meant as humor and chuckled politely. Before anyone spoke again, the range officer announced that the distant steel target had been confirmed at approximately 4,000 meters for a special demonstration. A quiet murmur spread across the firing line. Several experienced Marines exchanged doubtful looks. Even with advanced optics and carefully calculated ballistic data, everyone understood that such a distance demanded exceptional conditions and remarkable skill. Ethan glanced toward Daniel with another amused grin. "Well, there is the impossible target." He raised his voice just enough for nearby shooters to hear. "Sir, if you trust that orange rifle so much, why not show us what it can do?" A few Marines laughed while others looked toward the elderly veteran with genuine curiosity. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes from the firing mat. There was no irritation in his face, Only if the range permits it, he answered. Ethan spread his hands. You are not backing away? No. Then prove your point. The conversation carried farther than Ethan intended. Several officers turned toward the exchange while the range officer paused, uncertain whether to stop the discussion or let it continue. Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed watched Daniel closely. The elderly veteran did not react like someone accepting a challenge to protect his pride. He reacted like someone calmly agreeing to another ordinary day of work. That difference immediately caught Reed's attention. Daniel reached down and rested one weathered hand across the worn orange stock. His fingers settled naturally into familiar positions, polished smooth by decades of careful handling. For just a moment, his expression drifted somewhere beyond the firing line, beyond the distant mountains, beyond the bright desert sun itself. Reed recognized that look. It was the quiet expression worn by experienced marksman moments before complete concentration replaced every unnecessary thought. Ethan remained convinced the elderly veteran had simply accepted a challenge he could never complete. This ought to be interesting, he said with an easy smile. Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed never answered. He continued studying Daniel's breathing, the relaxed shoulders, the effortless balance, and the complete absence of nervous movement. None of those details belonged to an amateur. None belonged to someone trying to impress a crowd. Reed quietly removed his phone from his pocket. Without taking his eyes off the elderly veteran, he opened his contact list and selected one name that very few Marines would ever call without a serious reason. Major General Richard Lawson. Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed stepped away from the observation platform and pressed the call button before he could second-guess his own instincts. The line connected after only 2 rings. General Lawson speaking. Reed straightened automatically. Sir, I apologize for interrupting your schedule. Go ahead, Master Guns. Reed glanced toward Daniel Brooks, who remained kneeling beside the orange rifle with complete composure, while the younger Marines continued whispering among themselves. Sir, there is an elderly veteran on the long-range line. He has accepted a demonstration shot that most people here believe cannot be made. The general answered calmly. That alone does not explain this phone call. Reed nodded to himself. No, sir, it does not. He lowered his voice. It is the way he prepares. A brief silence followed. Explain. Reed watched Daniel rest one hand across the worn stock before slowly studying the distant range through nothing more than careful observation. He has not touched a ballistic computer. He has not asked for wind data. He has barely looked through the optic. He has spent almost all of his time watching the mirage, the flags, and the terrain. General Lawson remained silent for several seconds. What is his name? Daniel Brooks, sir. Another pause. Age? 83, sir. Former Marine? Yes, sir. Reed heard the faint sound of a chair sliding backward. Stay where you are, the general said quietly. Do not begin the demonstration until I arrive. Yes, sir. The call ended. Reed slowly lowered the phone, surprised by how quickly the conversation had changed direction. Across the firing line, Corporal Ethan Miller continued smiling as he spoke with several Marines who were already predicting how quickly the old rifle would disappoint its owner. Daniel appeared completely untouched by the growing audience. He gently lifted the orange rifle from its case and placed it across the shooting mat with unmistakable care. His fingertips paused over small scratches in the worn finish, and for just a moment the bright desert faded behind memories only he could see. The orange stock had not always looked that way. Years earlier, after leaving active service, the rifle had been legally refinished in bright orange for civilian training and demonstration purposes. The color had changed. The history inside the rifle had not. Daniel remembered long mornings on windswept ranges where instructors insisted that patience mattered more than speed. He remembered countless hours learning to read shifting air currents by watching heat shimmer above distant ground instead of depending on instruments that could never measure every yard between shooter and target. He remembered being told that rifles did not become trustworthy because they were expensive. They became trustworthy because someone learned every sound, every movement, and every tiny characteristic they possessed. The memory faded as another warm gust crossed the firing line. Daniel opened his eyes and quietly observed the distant hills once again. He noticed the nearest range flag lifting steadily while the farther flag moved only slightly. Heat shimmer drifted differently above the valley than it did near the firing position. Every detail settled silently into place inside his mind. Nearby, Ethan folded his arms with easy confidence. "You still have time to change your mind," he called. Daniel looked toward him with a gentle smile. "Thank you. Nobody will think less of you." Daniel nodded politely. "I am not here to make anyone think more of me." The simple answer left Ethan unexpectedly quiet. A few moments later, the distant sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the range road. Several Marines turned toward the entrance as black command vehicles rolled slowly into view. The quiet conversations stopped almost immediately. Major General Richard Lawson had arrived. Major General Richard Lawson stepped out of the command vehicle with calm purpose, acknowledging the Marines who greeted him before directing his attention toward the firing line. The conversations that had filled the range only moments earlier faded into respectful silence. Corporal Ethan Miller immediately stood straighter, surprised that a routine training day had suddenly drawn the personal attention of one of the most senior officers on the installation. Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed walked forward to meet the general and quietly explained the situation while gesturing toward the elderly veteran preparing beside the bright orange rifle. General Lawson listened without interruption. When Reed finished, the general asked only one question. "Has he fired yet?" "No, sir." "Good." Instead of walking toward the observation platform reserved for senior visitors, the general crossed the range directly toward Daniel Brooks. The elderly veteran looked up as the general approached and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, General." Lawson returned the greeting with genuine respect. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Several Marines exchanged confused glances. They had expected the general to inspect equipment or speak with instructors, not greet an elderly civilian by name. Ethan watched the brief exchange with growing uncertainty. The general stopped beside the shooting mat and looked down at the orange rifle for only a moment before returning his attention to Daniel. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed tells me you accepted quite a challenge." Daniel smiled gently. "I accepted an opportunity to enjoy the range." Lawson's expression softened. "That sounds more like you." Ethan frowned. The familiarity between the two men made no sense to him. The general did not ask to inspect the rifle. He did not question Daniel's qualifications. Instead, he slowly turned toward the assembled Marines. "From this moment forward," he said clearly, "there will be complete silence on the firing line until the demonstration is finished." Every conversation ended immediately. Even the instructors lowered their voices. A steady desert breeze crossed the valley, lifting the distant range flags against the pale blue sky. Daniel quietly settled into position behind the rifle. He adjusted nothing in haste. The worn sling rested naturally beneath his supporting arm while his breathing remained slow and even. He briefly looked across the terrain instead of through the optic, studying the shimmering heat rising from the desert floor. His eyes moved from one distant ridge to another, then paused on the smallest movement of the range flags scattered across the valley. Nearby Marines checked handheld weather meters and compared digital readings one final time. Daniel never reached for any electronic device. Ethan whispered to another Marine. "He is not even calculating anything." The Marine answered softly, "Maybe he already has." Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed continued watching every detail. It was not the rifle that convinced him. It was Daniel's complete absence of unnecessary movement. Every breath, every adjustment, every pause appeared deliberate. Years of disciplined repetition revealed themselves without a single spoken explanation. General Lawson folded his hands behind his back and remained perfectly still, refusing to interrupt the quiet concentration settling over the range. No one laughed anymore. No one looked at the orange rifle with amusement. Curiosity had replaced confidence, and silence had replaced mockery. Daniel finally rested his cheek against the stock with the ease of someone greeting an old companion. He looked once through the optic, then lifted his eyes again to watch the distant mirage drifting above the sunlit ground. Only after another patient breath did he lower his gaze behind the scope a second time. The entire range seemed to pause with him, waiting for the moment when decades of forgotten experience would speak more clearly than any words ever could. Daniel Brooks remained perfectly still behind the orange rifle, as though time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of his breathing. Around him, dozens of Marines watched without speaking. The only sounds crossing the desert were the soft whisper of the wind through dry grass, the distant flutter of range flags, and the faint metallic ring of target frames shifting under the steady afternoon breeze. Daniel never rushed to settle behind the optic. Instead, he lifted his eyes above it once more, studying the shimmering bands of heat dancing across the valley. The mirage drifted gently from left to right near the firing line, then shifted almost imperceptibly farther downrange where the terrain dipped before rising again toward the distant steel target. He watched the smallest movements until they formed a complete picture inside his mind. Nearby, several Marines compared numbers on handheld weather meters and quietly entered fresh corrections into ballistic calculators. Corporal Ethan Miller glanced between their electronic screens and the elderly veteran who seemed to rely on nothing except patience. "He still has not adjusted anything," Ethan whispered. Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed answered softly without taking his eyes off Daniel. "He has been adjusting since the moment he stepped onto this range." Ethan looked confused. Reed continued. "He is not reading one wind. He is reading every wind between here and the target." General Richard Lawson stood silently behind them, listening without interruption. Daniel finally lowered his cheek against the worn stock. The orange finish showed years of careful use, polished smooth where countless hours of practice had left quiet reminders instead of scars. His breathing remained slow and even. One careful breath entered. Another quietly left. His finger rested outside the trigger guard while he observed the distant steel through the optic. After several seconds, he slowly lifted his head again, watching a range flag halfway across the valley begin to settle. A faint smile crossed his face. He had been waiting for exactly that change. Without speaking, he made the smallest adjustment to the elevation and windage controls, movements so slight that most observers never noticed them. Then he settled naturally behind the rifle once more. His shoulders relaxed. His support hand remained steady beneath the stock. There was no tension in his posture, only familiarity earned through years of disciplined repetition. The range officer quietly confirmed that the distant steel target was ready. No countdown followed. No dramatic announcement interrupted the silence. Daniel simply waited through another slow breath before allowing the world around him to disappear. General Lawson watched closely, recognizing the unmistakable calm of someone whose greatest strength was never speed but complete control. Ethan unconsciously stopped breathing for a moment as every Marine on the firing line fixed their attention on the elderly veteran. Even the breeze seemed gentler now, as though the desert itself had paused. Daniel's eyes remained calm behind the optic. His breathing reached its natural resting point. His finger moved with measured precision toward the trigger, not with force but with quiet confidence. The entire range waited in complete silence, every expectation suspended between doubt and belief, as decades of forgotten experience prepared to answer every joke that had echoed across the firing line earlier that morning. Daniel Brooks allowed the final breath to leave his lungs as naturally as the desert breeze moving across the valley. Nothing about his posture changed except the almost invisible pressure of his finger, completing a motion that had been practiced so many times it no longer required conscious thought. The sharp report rolled across the range before fading into the open landscape. Every Marine instinctively lifted their eyes toward the distant hillside where the small steel target stood almost impossible to distinguish against the shimmering heat. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The valley seemed suspended between expectation and uncertainty. Then, several long seconds later, a clear metallic ring floated back through the desert air. The sound was faint because of the extraordinary distance, yet unmistakable. It echoed across the firing line like a single quiet note that silenced every remaining doubt. No cheers followed. There was only complete stillness. Corporal Ethan Miller stared toward the distant target without blinking. His confident smile disappeared, replaced by genuine disbelief. One of the range technicians immediately raised a high-powered spotting scope and carefully confirmed the result. He looked once through the optic, lowered his head in surprise, then looked again as though expecting reality to change. Finally, he turned toward the range officer. "Confirmed," he said quietly. "Direct impact." Another technician verified the observation using independent optics before slowly nodding in agreement. Around the firing line, Marines exchanged stunned glances. Several looked from the distant target back to the bright orange rifle, unable to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the assumptions they had carried only minutes earlier. Daniel remained exactly where he was. He did not celebrate. He did not smile with satisfaction. He calmly opened the rifle's action, verified its safe condition, and rested it gently across the shooting mat before removing his eye from the optic. His expression looked no different than it had before the demonstration began. Major General Richard Lawson watched him for several quiet seconds before turning toward Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed. "You were right to call me," he said softly. Reed nodded once. "It was never about the rifle, sir." "No," the general replied. "It never was." Corporal Ethan slowly walked toward Daniel, each step carrying less confidence than the one before it. When he finally stopped beside the elderly veteran, he looked down at the orange stock with entirely different eyes. "Sir," he said quietly, "I do not understand how you did that without all the equipment everyone else depends on." Daniel gently brushed a trace of desert dust from the worn stock before answering. "The equipment is valuable." Ethan looked puzzled. "Then why did you not use it?" Daniel glanced toward the distant hills where the afternoon wind continued moving across the valley. "Because today I trusted something that took longer to build." Ethan remained silent. Daniel looked at him with the same calm kindness he had shown all morning. "Experience does not replace technology," he said. "It teaches you when technology has reached its limit." Those simple words settled deeply over the firing line. No one laughed anymore. The bright orange rifle no longer looked unusual. It looked respected. General Lawson slowly stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the elderly veteran. Around them, every Marine instinctively straightened, sensing that the most important moment of the day had not been the remarkable shot itself, but what the general was about to say next. Major General Richard Lawson stopped only a few feet from Daniel Brooks, the warm desert wind moving quietly between them while the distant steel target remained almost invisible against the mountains. Every Marine on the firing line watched in complete silence. Daniel had already placed the orange rifle safely across the shooting mat and stood with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the morning. There was no trace of triumph in his face. He had never come to defeat anyone. He had simply accepted an opportunity to demonstrate what patience and experience could still accomplish. The general looked first at the weathered rifle before meeting Daniel's eyes. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "how many years has it been?" Daniel smiled gently. "Long enough for the rifle to collect more stories than I have." A faint smile crossed the general's face. "Some stories deserve to be remembered." He turned slowly toward the assembled Marines. "Every one of you witnessed something important today, but if you believe it was only an extraordinary shot, then you missed the real lesson." The Marines remained perfectly still. General Lawson continued, "Modern equipment gives us remarkable capabilities. We should always value it. But equipment has never replaced judgment, discipline, or experience. Those qualities are earned over years, not purchased with newer technology." His words settled across the range with unmistakable weight. Corporal Ethan Miller lowered his eyes toward the concrete before stepping forward once again. This time there was no confidence in his posture, only sincere respect. "Sir," he said to Daniel, "I owe you an apology. I judged your rifle before I understood the man carrying it." Daniel looked at the young Marine with quiet kindness. "We all make quick judgments sometimes." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Not like this." Daniel rested one hand gently on the orange stock. "The important part is recognizing them before they become permanent." Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He had seen skilled Marines grow throughout his career, but he knew that the greatest lessons rarely came from formal instruction. They arrived unexpectedly, carried by people whose appearance encouraged others to underestimate them. General Lawson stepped closer to Daniel. Without hesitation, he came to attention and rendered a crisp Marine salute. For one brief heartbeat, absolute silence filled the range. Then Master Gunnery Sergeant Reed stood at attention and saluted as well. One after another, Marines throughout the firing line instinctively followed. No orders were given. No commands echoed across the desert. Respect spread naturally from one person to the next until every uniformed Marine stood quietly honoring the elderly veteran. Daniel looked across the line of raised hands before slowly returning the salute with practiced confidence that had never faded despite the passing decades. His movement was smooth, precise, and completely natural. When both men lowered their hands, nobody applauded. The silence itself carried far more meaning than applause ever could. The desert breeze lifted the nearby range flags once again, while the bright orange rifle rested peacefully across the shooting mat. It no longer looked unusual. It looked historic. Every Marine understood that the color covering its stock had hidden nothing. The true value of the rifle had always rested in the decades of discipline, humility, and quiet mastery carried by the man who held it. In that moment, the firing line stopped seeing an elderly visitor with an old rifle and began seeing exactly what had been standing before them from the very beginning. A Marine whose greatest achievement was not a remarkable shot across an extraordinary distance, but a lifetime that had quietly earned the respect now surrounding him. The afternoon sun slowly settled toward the western horizon, casting long golden shadows across the Marine Corps training range as the final shooters packed their equipment and prepared to leave. Conversations returned, but they no longer sounded the same as they had that morning. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful voices and quiet respect. Daniel Brooks carefully lifted the orange rifle from the shooting mat and wiped away a thin layer of desert dust with the same worn cloth he had used before the demonstration. He inspected the rifle one last time, closed the case with gentle care, and rested his weathered hand on the handle for a brief moment before lifting it from the ground. There was no celebration waiting for him. That was exactly how he preferred it. Corporal Ethan Miller walked across the range carrying Daniel's folded shooting mat. He stopped beside the elderly veteran and held it out with both hands. "Sir," he said quietly, "I would be honored if you would allow me to carry this to your truck." Daniel smiled warmly. "Thank you, Corporal." Together they walked slowly across the gravel parking area beneath the fading sunlight. Neither man hurried to fill the silence. After several moments, Ethan finally spoke. "I thought the orange paint meant the rifle had lost its value." Daniel looked toward the old case in his hand. Sometimes people see a new color and forget to ask about the history underneath. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I will remember that." Behind them, Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Reed watched the two figures walking side by side and quietly smiled. General Richard Lawson joined him near the observation platform. "He learned more today than marksmanship," the general said. Reed nodded. "Yes, sir. That lesson will stay with him much longer." Nearby, younger Marines began sharing the story with others who had not witnessed the demonstration. Yet none of them talked only about the remarkable distance. They spoke about the calm patience of the elderly veteran, the quiet confidence that never needed attention, and the simple dignity of a man who had answered mockery with humility instead of anger. Daniel reached his old pickup truck, placed the rifle case carefully inside, and closed the tailgate with unhurried hands. Before climbing into the driver's seat, he looked once more toward the distant firing line, where Marines continued cleaning the range for the next day of training. He tipped his veteran's cap gently toward them. Several Marines immediately returned the gesture with respectful nods. Ethan stood at attention without being asked. General Lawson raised one final salute from across the parking area, and Daniel returned it with the same precise movement that had become second nature decades earlier. Then he quietly started the truck and drove away as the evening light settled across the desert. No escort followed him. No ceremony announced his departure. The range simply grew quiet again, but everyone standing there understood that something lasting had changed. The orange rifle would always be remembered, not because of its unusual appearance, but because it reminded an entire generation that true mastery is never measured by appearances alone. Long after the tire tracks disappeared beneath the evening wind, the lesson remained clear in every Marine's mind. Respect is never earned by demanding attention. It is earned through character, patience, and a lifetime of doing ordinary things with extraordinary excellence. Some rifles become antiques. Some become legends. But the greatest legacy always belongs to the person whose quiet example teaches others how to carry honor long after the final shot has faded into silence.